Just trickling in here now, Marsha. I've just sent an email reminder to everybody that had registered in with us, just with the meeting links. I'm sure people will be continue to trickle in throughout, but I make that now 16 minutes past, so we'll make a start anyway. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for today's lunchtime session. Absolutely thrilled to be welcoming Marsha Ramroop with us today to talk about cultural intelligence and it as a strategy towards thinking about inclusion. For any of you that don't know, Marsha is the Director of Inclusion at RIBA. If you missed it, towards the end of last year, Marsha took on a crazy project hosting RIBA Radio for a period of, how many days was it, Marsha?
It was 7 days of
seven
live
full days.
broadcasting, yes.
Yes, which was all content that's strongly related to cultural intelligence. So if you haven't seen it, a lot of it is all recorded on YouTube, and I'd recommend you going back and catching much of that, because it really is a really interesting watch, not just to listen, but great interviews and lots of people in RIBA headquarters as well talking to Marsha. We're going to do about sort of 25 minutes, half an hour today with Marsha speaking, and then we'll be really pleased to take any questions or thoughts from you guys at the end. Very much conversation today at that point. Just a bit of housekeeping. If you can, make sure to keep your microphones muted throughout whenever Marsha's speaking, that'd be great. If you have any questions that are really burning, whatever, just drop them into the chat and we can either address them at the time or probably leave them to the question and answer section at the end. But for the time being, I'll hand over to you, Marsha, if that's okay.
Thanks very much indeed, and good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to just do a note on terminology. So EDI, which I'm going to reference quite a lot, EDI, stands for equity, diversity and inclusion. So diversity is simply the mix of visible and invisible difference. So it is not just about race, or it's not just about gender. It can include things like neurodivergence. It can include different professional standing. It can include geographical locations. So diversity, simply the mix of visible and invisible difference. Inclusion is the culture where all difference is valued, respected and acknowledged. So inclusion is the culture, and equity is not the same as equality. So equality is about everyone getting the same, which is great if we're all at the same start point. But the reality in our life is that we're not all at the same start point. So equity is about making up for historic imbalance and addressing individual needs. Now, you may well have heard me do a talk similar to this one before, and if you have, I really hope that you'll be able to find something new, something different to reflect on and points to consider within it. If not, I hope you understand that doing these kinds of talks, for me, it's in my nature to use these occasions to provoke questions, rethinking, and an opportunity for cognitive evolution. I'm going to speak to you for about 25 minutes. I'm going to share just one slide towards the end, so I'm afraid you're going to just have to put up with looking at me for all this time. And then I'll open up for questions at the end. So like Greg suggested, if you want to pop them in the chat, I will answer them at the end. Now, I'm not an architect, so I asked an architecture trained colleague to summarise for me the purpose of architecture. And what she shared with me was this stream of consciousness, which are the exact following words. And I've considered them to be pure poetry, so I've reframed them as such. She said, "Great architecture is uplifting, inspiring, delightful, transformative. It's a work of art where you can feel the quality and depth of thinking in every tiny detail, from the swing of a door to the position of a window, its place in a city or landscape, its impact on the climate or neighbourhood. Architects are amazing problem solvers, marriage counsellors, and mediators. Architects are artists. Hearing that, I was also reminded of Sir David Adjaye's words when receiving the Royal Gold Medal last year. His work I summarised in 3 words: function, beauty, community. Now, it's been made clear to me that I still need to answer the question, why do we need to think about EDI in architecture? I'd say that architecture and RIBA cannot be great if it doesn't. We may think we are, but that's from the corner of our own minds and experiences. But when we consider the swing of the door or the position of a window, is it only functional, beautiful, and encompassing for you and those like you, or for many? When we place in a city, are we involving the voices of all the communities, not just the loudest voices? When we try to problem solve, are we approaching those problems from a true mix of perspectives and arriving at truly innovative solutions? I had a thought yesterday. There's much of the world that we don't experience because of who we are not. And yet, how often do we design our world to reflect that? We must be better at EDI because there are people who can bring greatness into this profession and we're not letting them in. We need to be better at EDI because those who do get in aren't always given a strong enough voice. We must be better at EDI because architecture has greater potential, which together we can fulfill. The issues we face in EDI, in the workplace and in architecture are societal. They're not specific to any individual or any sector, but it's beholden upon every one of us to tackle it. As Steve Grunert and Todd Whitaker say in their book, School Culture Rewired, the culture of any organisation is shaped by the worst behaviour the leader is willing to tolerate. Now, if you believe that, which I do, we must conversely also believe that the culture of any organisation can be shaped by the best behaviours that leaders are willing to demonstrate. So who am I to tell you all of this? As you know, my name's Marsha Ramroop and I've not always been an EDI specialist. And as Greg mentioned, for 30 years, I pursued a career in radio and journalism. I worked for the BBC on and off for 25 years, and I chose to leave that career to push forward with my inclusion work. And some people have asked me, how do you move from journalism to inclusion? And to be honest, it hasn't been that big of a shift given the way that I've always approached my work. I've always been happiest and most purposeful when working directly with different communities, going into their space and asking them what their stories are, how they wanted to tell them, and telling them in a way that they felt comfortable with. I instigated media literacy projects, I provided people with the skills and the equipment to do this, and I lived by, and I still do, a personal motto that I'm to give the unheard voice a place to speak. And as I went through my journalism career, most of the times I tried to do this, I wasn't supported, and often I was met with resistance. There's a clear misunderstanding about how to do EDI. And there's an absence of understanding about how to do it better. And that is when I discovered CQ, Cultural Intelligence. And I set up my own consultancy in strategic inclusion called Unheard Voice. CQ is the missing link. It's the behaviours necessary to move people from knowing why they want to do EDI better to actual, tangible, successful outcomes. So what is stopping you from using your existing skills, knowledge and abilities to be inclusive architects, driving forward change. What causes discrimination and underrepresentation? Is how to tackle discrimination in architecture something that can be taught? Does architecture have a future if in our fast evolving demography we're struggling to future-proof? These philosophical, even existential questions are ones we must start thinking about if we're going to be effective at inclusion in architecture. To do anything else is to firefight at the edges of the issues, to manage the symptoms and not eradicate the cause. To do anything else is to let down the profession that you love. So we come back to the question, what stops us from doing this better? What are the roots of discrimination? And when we peel back the layers of this question, we find an answer: our bias. Professor Timothy Wilson, in his work Stranger to Ourselves, Discovering the Adaptive Unconscious, says we have 11 million pieces of information being processed by our brain at any given moment, but the conscious capacity to process just 40. So at any given moment, your brain is processing 10,999,960 bits of information, of which you are completely unaware. The shortcutting of information is a human biological need, and it's the root of bias creation. Now, not all biases are bad, but equally, not all of them are useful. Unconscious bias awareness workshops have been recommended quite extensively as a panacea to EDI concerns, but it is not one. In December 2020, unconscious bias training was scrapped for civil servants in England because ministers followed the data and they realised that it didn't work. Now, the UK government, it followed this data, it said there was no evidence, and it had urged other public sector employers to end this kind of training, but it didn't replace it with anything else. And so one really has to question what they're really up to. But it's clear that understanding that unconscious bias exists, how it manifests itself, and the impact is important. But expecting people to just be aware of their unconscious and mitigate it themselves as a result of a workshop intervention is not actually possible. If you take a recently updated academic paper by Forsha Lai et al., it aggregated into 492 studies with nearly 90,000 participants on the idea, does unconscious bias awareness, one-off interventions and workshops work? And it concluded that it found that changes in bias as a result of workshops didn't really occur. If it did, weak changes in thinking occurred, but that didn't mediate in downstream changes in behaviour. And if they were trivial in nature. So what the recommendation of the author of the report was, don't try to change your bias. Instead, focus on working around it, target other intergroup outcomes, and teach people to create procedural changes that prevent the influence of hidden biases. Now, if you add to the work of Alexandra Kalev, who's the professor of sociology and anthropology at Tel Aviv University, she found that not only bad training and one-off interventions didn't work, but that it can be counterproductive. So she says that one theory is that if training tells us that we're all biased, we might no longer think that we need to make any effort, or that making any effort will make any difference. Afterwards, a participant might come away with a sense of relief. They've been shown that their bias really isn't their fault at all. The eagerness to label all bias as unconscious could allow us to evade our responsibility for the harm that it causes. Now, face-to-face online unconscious bias awareness workshops, whilst good at helping people realise that it exists and how it manifests itself, is really important, but it doesn't do enough about impact and expects people to mitigate it themselves, and makes no mention of the requirement of the processes and structures to change in order to assist with mitigation. Daniel Kahneman, the father of heuristics, he says it's extremely difficult to catch yourself doing something unconsciously. And when asked why we're made a decision, we'll convince ourselves of a valid reason, when in reality, our unconscious forced ourselves to come to a conclusion based on our bias. I'm actually going to quote from his book. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is about how we make our decisions. And that thinking fast, that's our 10,999,960 bits of information that our brain is constantly processing. He calls that our system 1. And then thinking slow is that 40 pieces of information that we're consciously processing. He calls that our system 2. And he says this: the attentive system 2 is who we think we are. System 2 articulates judgments and makes choices, but it often endorses or rationalizes ideas and feelings that were generated by System 1, the fast thinking. You may not know that you're optimistic about a project because something about its leader reminds you of your beloved sister, or that you dislike a person who looks vaguely like your dentist. If asked for an explanation, however, you will search your memory for presentable reasons, and you will certainly find some. Moreover, you will believe the story that you make up. Often we make mistakes because our system 2, doesn't know any better. System 1, the fast thinking, is indeed the origin of much of what we do wrong, but is also the origin of most of what we do right, which is most of what we do. Our thoughts and our actions are routinely guided by System 1 and are generally on the mark. However, it does not generate a warning signal when it becomes unreliable. There's no simple way for our consciousness, or System 2, to distinguish between a skilled and a shortcut or biased response. Its only recourse is to slow down and to attempt to construct an answer on its own. In 2019, the Journal of Social Psychology published some research. Psychologists showed people their own behaviours, but then pretended they were the behaviours of someone else. When asked, participants reliably said they were less racist than this other person, who then turned out to be themselves. So even when shown your own behaviours, you won't necessarily recognise them as being yours. And Caroline Criado Perez, in her book Invisible Women, about the massive data gap that exists in our world between men and women, because men are seen as the norm representing all humans, says this: studies have shown that a belief in your own personal objectivity, or a belief that you're not sexist, makes you less objective and more likely to behave in a sexist way. Women were not found to exhibit this bias, who believe that they're objective in hiring decisions are more likely to hire a male applicant than an identically described female applicant. So report after report shows, study after study show, that the repeated suggestion that we can, simply by being aware, mitigate our own bias is not correct. We must stop saying and teaching that. We need to put less store by one-off training interventions and more by the structures and processes that we need to create, implement and enforce to mitigate our biases. We must also put more effort into creating a culture of feedback, where it's okay to call out each other's bias and mistakes, because a diversity of staff can see it and feel it more clearly than we ever can in ourselves, and for the recipient of that feedback not to be defensive about it. And we have to allow those who see and feel the impact of our behaviours to call out these issues, and we mustn't vilify them for it. Bias is our biggest enemy when it comes to sustained and sustainable change. So how we move forward must always be cognizant of this. Even when we think we're doing well, we mustn't rest on our laurels, because our very being is encouraging us to make assumptions, even when we think we are not. And so that's why it's so important to surround yourself with a diversity of lived experience, to listen to those voices and act on those that are very different from our own. We have to break the cycle of our bias supporting our systems which perpetuate in society, which reinforce our bias, and very little changing, which leads to diversity fatigue. And even as you listen to me, you know, you can hear others saying it. Maybe you're even saying it to yourself. Enough already. I've seen enough in the news about racism. I've heard enough about gender fluidity. I don't care anymore that women are murdered on their way home from a run, or that poor people can burn alive in their homes. No one can say that architecture doesn't hold some of the solutions to these issues. Does great architecture fatigue of these issues? Great architecture considers if we value life in all its richness, we place value on all life. Great architecture never looks at value purely in terms of pounds and pence. When we have done so, we have lost so many valuable gifts in our society, including our humanity. Doesn't great architecture brim with humanity? Thinking about the challenge of EDI and creating inclusive architecture is very much about these issues. Now, if this is the outcome, if this is what we need, what is pushing us to think and act in this biased way in the first place? There's a very real and growing argument to suggest that capitalism as a system forces us to subjugate others. If you understand EDI in the context of just moving pieces round on the same board, you will not succeed in EDI efforts in architecture. Effective EDI is about recognising the systems that work to discriminate and attempting to subvert and dismantle them. The quote attributed to Einstein is a definition of madness, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. In addition to this, his actual quote, "Problems can't be solved with the same level of consciousness that created them in the first place," is more useful. Thinking about the challenge of EDI in architecture is very much about us creating workplaces that are utterly attuned and totally conscious of the systems around us, that assume we can still function and work within them and create an equitable society. And I think it's unnecessarily restrictive to think in terms of managing our businesses and our economics purely in terms of binaries like capitalism and socialism. That's an unnecessary dichotomy. We have to be cleverer than that. So how do we do this? This is where my paradigm underpinned with CQ comes in. Cultural intelligence, the capability to work and relate effectively with people who are different from you, when applied properly, forces us to consciously and deliberately challenge ourselves and the perspectives we're taking. And this is the one thing, the one slide that I'm going to share with you. CQ is made up of 4 capabilities. The first is CQ drive. Are you motivated? Do you actually want to work and relate effectively with people who are different from you? And if you're not motivated, if you don't have the confidence, how do you motivate yourself? The second capability is CQ knowledge. What do you know? What do you need to know? Not only about different lived experiences, different values, norms and belief systems, But what do you need to know about other businesses, other organisations, other legal and economic systems, other leadership styles, other languages? The language of architecture is very particular. How does it compare with the language of the NHS, for example? And understanding all of this helps us be more effective. The third piece of the puzzle I consider to be most important, because if you have some motivation and some knowledge and you go straight into action without stopping to think about what you're thinking about, to check your assumptions, to be hugely self-aware, to be organisationally aware, then you're going to act, write policy, and lead in a very tokenistic and stereotypical way. And so CQ strategies, that metacognition piece, stopping to check. And then the fourth capability, CQ action. Ultimately, people judge us on our behaviours, and people who are high in CQ action have a broad repertoire of adaptable behaviours in order to be effective at working and relating with others. I say that CQ, the language of it is not confrontational, but the level of introspection required can be uncomfortable. And this is what we need to do to create an intersectional approach to how we look at EDI. But that's not enough to have these behavioural cornerstones. We need to implement change in our organisations. And to do that, we need to have 4 cornerstones of change. The first is role modelling. People are more likely to behave inclusively if they see their leaders and their colleagues doing so. We need to foster understanding conviction. People need to know why they're being asked to be inclusive. So this is a comms piece, but also the data piece, which needs to be robust. We need to develop talents and skills. So this is about training around CQ, of course, is what I would advocate. But it's also about embedding things like objectives in our appraisals to be inclusive as well. So people have the opportunity to behave in inclusive ways. And then we need supportive formal mechanisms. So recruitment processes, procurement processes, the way that we write our policies need to have inclusivity baked into them. And when we wrap this all up together and we implement them in organisations from the very top at a CEO level, at individual, team, departmental and organisational level across the 4 areas of the business. So how we attract and educate people in architecture, how we treat, progress and retain them in the profession, how we create our products and services, and also how we reach out to our customers and clients. That is how we look to create an inclusive culture in our organisations. It's an intersectional approach that I've implemented in other organisations, and it's what I've been doing at the RIBA and what I'd like to continue doing in architecture. We then have a fighting chance of tackling the wider societal concerns which dog our lives. We need to lead inclusion, which is an act, to manage diversity, which is the fact of visible and invisible difference, to create equity, the impact. Every organisation lives within our societies and we need momentum to create change. Now, I find this paradigm quite easy to describe. I think it's straightforward for you to conceptualise, and I also like you to think of the strategy in terms of being like a bag of sand, a holistic strategy to be able to move forward with creating inclusion. But like a bag of sand, when you rip it open, it's a very granular, very detailed piece of work. One grain might be a menopause policy, another might be guidance around inclusive language, another might be a framework for inclusive design. And collectively too, the prerequisites or fundamentals for implementing EDI well and demonstrating commitment. My latest acronym is that you need to stream your EDI efforts. You need to provide support, time, resource, effort, agency, and money. So support leadership needs to be demonstrative and vocal about the EDI. Time, people need to be given the opportunity to change, and the EDI teams given time to reflect and support comprehensively. Resource, the facilities made available for people to have the full implementation of inclusive changes. Effort, enough people with expertise and EDI in a team to manage your workload effectively, agency, the most senior EDI colleague to have the unmediated ear of the CEO and full influencing access across your boards, and money, budget expectations met and sustained with EDI work. Now, the RIBA has a role to play in supporting its members, and like Greg mentioned, one of the ways that I've done that is through creating RIBA Radio. There are now podcast 29 episodes to help you with going on your inclusion journey. And also coming up on the 6th of May, one of the final pieces of work that I have as the outgoing Director of Inclusion at the RIBA is a live CPD webinar with me and Terry Okoro about EDI in architecture using cultural intelligence. Now, the size of the task at hand can be scary. I get it. But we must each take personal responsibility for it, because by changing our world, we can change the world. And when the size of the task becomes too much, I like to reflect on the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. He said, fly. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, you must keep moving forward. Thank you. I'll take your questions.
Thank you very much, Marsha. That was fantastic. Really, really appreciate all your thoughts. That's a lot to take in, I'm sure, for a lot of people. But just before we start to, I open up for questions from other folks. A couple of things. First of all, I forgot to mention at the start of the session here, we always include a little feedback questionnaire, which I'm just going to pop it in the chat function. It really is just more of testing people's thoughts on what they'd like to see more from the RSUA around sessions like this. So if you find it's been useful, then please go ahead and just answer the 5 or 6 questions that's featured on that survey. But one of the things that I had coming out of that of what you just said there, Marsha, was it was very interesting in regards to the biases that we all feel that we don't really know about ourselves, I suppose. You mentioned about how the process in addressing these kind of issues can sometimes be, it requires people to dig deep a little bit. What are the ways, or some simple ways, I suppose, in that making people feel safe as part of that process? Because if it was requiring them to dig deep within themselves for something that's ultimately quite personal within the working environment, how do you approach that gets people participating in a way that they feel open and that they can be honest about things in a way that they're not going to be, I suppose, reprimanded, or that their views can be heard, honestly?
Yeah, creating a sort of culture of psychological safety is something that very much leaders have to role model. So it's about demonstrating vulnerability as leaders, and someone has to take the first step around that. I think we all make mistakes, and we all can do and say the wrong things. It's human to do so. So in order to feel safe, when a leader hears that feedback that maybe they've done something that they shouldn't have, they have to be vulnerable to saying, I accept that this is how the impact of my behaviours have landed. I am going to go away and acknowledge, learn, reflect, listen, and move forward differently. And when you open yourself up to that kind of vulnerability, you find that actually the way that that is received is so much better than a defensive response, which is more likely to create the pushback, if you like, which then can make you feel more vulnerable. But actually, the act of initially opening yourself up to saying, hands up, I've done something wrong here. So the creating of that culture of psychological safety starts with leaders admitting that they can get it wrong, preparing to do things differently by doing the learning, reflecting and listening, And that then in turn allows staff to feel that they can come forward and say, this is a safe place for me to say the impact of behaviours have been on me the way that they have. I would recommend lots of reading around about bias. So Dr. Pragya Agarwal has, who I spoke to for RIBA Radio about unconscious bias. There's a whole hour with her. So her book Sway, you can listen to the podcast about that as well, unraveling the unconscious. And there's several other things that you can look up, which will help understand bias better, and therefore help work around it, like Calvin Lai suggests.
Great. Okay, thank you. Is there anybody that would like to pose a question either via the chat or in person even? If you're feeling brave on camera, feel free to come forward and...
I'm quite friendly.
Indeed.
Any feedback at all? Oh, we got a hand up.
Oh, you've got
Lindsay.
some hands up. Indeed. Lindsay, yes. Would you like to chime in on the chat, or are you going to... Please go ahead.
Hi, Marsha. Thanks very much for that. I mean, a huge amount to think about. It's interesting, your definition of architecture at the beginning. I think at the time there were 12 of us in the meeting, and probably if you'd asked 12 of us what architecture is, you probably would have got 13 different answers at the time. But my question is really maybe picks up on that about leaders. I mean, I work as an architect. I work in higher education, and our university is very well prepared in many ways with EDI. We have policies for it. It's probably been something that's been around for institutionally quite a while. But my experience is that it's very much driven by the individuals at the top, right down to the granular detail of, reinforcing the message, making sure that it's understood by everybody, who's part of the organization. And I've seen it come off the rails as well, for various reasons. And I'm wondering whether within your time at the RIBA, you feel that the message has got to, the upper parts of the organization. I mean, I accept we all have an individual responsibility to sort of address this, but, I'm just wondering, as, the RIBA is your employer, your task has been with them, how you feel that has gone.
It's a really good question. And very well put, because of course I've chosen to leave the organisation after just 14 months in the role. And so some people might question, what are the reasons for that, and has leadership had anything to do with that? What I would say is that the RIBA is made up of nearly 55,000 members, and it is a democratic system in which members can vote for who leads them. And there is, a group called the council which can influence, and that they're the voice at the table, if you like. And so if you want different leaders to have different behaviours, you need to vote in different people. If that's what you feel it might be missing from the organisation, I'm not making a comment one way or the other. There is an opportunity there, I think, for things to change if it's felt that the organisations don't have the or issuing the messages that you would want them to do. I think that the RIBA was hugely forward-thinking in hiring me to bring in the kind of changes that the organisation profession want to see. And what I would say, just because this is a very tricky question for me to answer, and I'm really trying to do so carefully, is that I want to stay in the architecture and built environment sector, because I very much believe in what I've just told you, that to create to influence the creation of inclusive spaces is to influence the creation of an inclusive society. And so that's why I have been doing the work that I've been doing at the RIBA. And that hasn't answered your question, I'm well aware.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, it is a complex question on many different levels, you know, and yeah, I can see the complexity in my own institution. So I'm not sort of trying to put the IBA on the line here or anything like that. So thank you for your talk.
Right. Thank you very much for the question, Lindsay. We appreciate it. And I didn't think you sat on the fence at all there, Marsha, to be perfectly honest, so don't worry too much. Francis, you've got a hand raised. Did you want to put a question out there?
Hi, Francis. Can't hear you though.
He's just getting switched on now, I think.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, there you go.
Okay. Sorry about that. I was on the wrong microphone. It's just a kind of an intuition I have developed over my years in practice, and that is that planning policy is extremely landowning, rich, white person centric.
Yeah.
And is very anti-poor people.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of an assumption that ordinary people developing or creating their own habitation, kind of in an uncontrolled way, God forbid, they should build a house somewhere, is kind of part of this mindset. And that really, as a wee suggestion for you, Marsha, maybe join the Royal Town or get into the Royal Town Planning Institute.
So in really good news, I've got some good news for you, Francis.
Good.
That the EDI leads of this is hot news. It's not even been announced. The RIBA, the RTPI, the ICE, the CIOB, the LI, and RICS are all working together to create a combined way forward in how we can be better at EDI in the built environment. There's a great book by Linda Scott called The Double X Economy. It's a potential of empowering women around the economy. And one of the key points made in that book is that across the world, land is owned by men and predominantly white men.
Yeah.
And so there is a huge if even our land isn't proportionately distributed, it's in the hands of very few, then we're going to struggle to do things equitably. So you make that's a really, really good point, but in a small way, but a significant way here. These joint 6 institutes are going to try to, or not even try, we're very happily collaborating to move forward.
I think you're going to have a fight on your hands.
I love the EDI lead at RTPI. We get on very well.
Yeah. Okay, look at watch their policies. That's the thing to watch.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work. There's clearly a lot of work to do, but we're getting going on it, and that's the main thing.
Sure.
I'm going to have to bravely run away, Greg.
Yes, indeed. And just before you do, Marsha, because I know you've got a meeting that started very shortly elsewhere, just if people are looking as a starting point now, would you recommend for them to go back to RIBA Radio to learn more about CQ as a starting point, and that will give them plenty of resources to go ahead and move forward? Yeah,
go to RIBA Radio, and then if you're able to sign up to the CPD, if you're a member of the RIBA, it's a free for members CPD 6th of May live webinar will be recorded as well. That's 2 hours on EDI and architecture using cultural intelligence as well. But yeah, those 29 episodes available of RIBA Radio will definitely get you going in the right direction.
Perfect. Thank you again so much for your time, Marsha. Thank you everybody else who attended today. Don't forget about that feedback survey. If you get 2 minutes just to fill that out for us, it would really help us point us in the right direction in the future. And in the meantime, thank you all again for attending. I'll see you all very soon.